And then, after Michaelmas, all the thanes in Yorkshire went to York, and there slew all Earl Tostig's household servants, and took his treasures. Tostig was at Britford with the king, who summoned a great council at Northampton, and then at Oxford. Tostig's brother, Earl Harold, would work for their reconciliation if he might, but he could not. They took Morcar for their earl, and Tostig then went oversea with his wife to Baldwin's lands to their winter residence at St. Omer.
So Harold Godwinson's brother, Tostig, was deposed from his Northumbrian earldom late in 1065 and exiled to his wife Judith's home in Flanders. But further major changes would happen in Britain as 1066 dawned.
In this year, the minster at Westminster was consecrated on Childmas Day. King Edward died on the eve of Twelfth Day, and he was buried the next day within the newly consecrated church. After his burial, the under-king, Harold, son of Earl Godwin, who the king had nominated as his successor, was chosen king by the chief magnates of all England. And on the same day Harold was crowned with great ceremony by Aldred, Archbishop of York.
Tostig was clearly not best pleased when his brother did not recall him from exile, so he set about scheming his own return. One French source suggests he visited Duke William, but that was hardly necessary, as his wife Judith and William's wife Matilda were as close as sisters. Both these women were active political players, so Tostig had an open channel to William to share his plans. The first documented journey was to his cousin, the King of Denmark.
Earl Tostig went to Denmark to see his kinsman, King Svein, and ask him to support his rightful status, for King Svein offered him power under himself in Denmark.
Norse sources report what we would recognise as a robust exchange between the cousins, with Sven noting that he was inviting him to attack Harold, who was also his cousin. Tostig departed, saying that he would take his appeal to Denmark's traditional enemy, Norway.
When Harold had ruled all Norway for 19 years, a man came from England named Tostig. He was a brother of Harold Godwinson, who ruled England, and thought his right of birth was equal to Harold's, but he was deprived of everything. He asked support of Harold and promised him half of England if they should win it.
Tostig was evidently persuasive, and King Harald, who would later be called Hardrada, quite literally hard ruler, decided to come out of semi-retirement and take an army to England. It is noteworthy that he took all his family, apart from his eldest son, who he had previously designated as the new king.
In the last part of winter, when the spring was about to come, King Harald sent a command throughout his kingdom that the army should make ready to leave the country in the summer, and appointed who was to go. The king had cargo ships made ready with an enormous quantity of provisions, and he appointed his son Magnus to stay behind in charge of the kingdom, but his son Olaf he took with him.
Tostig now began the campaign, which appears at the very least designed to restore his position in England. He started by raiding some of the family assets on the Isle of Wight, and it is suggested that this is when he communicated his plan to Duke William, for Tostig was a man with a clear and ambitious plan.
Soon after this, Earl Tostig came from beyond the sea into the Isle of Wight, and he was supplied with money and provisions. Then he committed outrages everywhere by the sea coast where he could land, until he came to Sandwich. When Tostig understood that King Harold was on the way to Sandwich, he departed and took some of the boatmen with him, willing and unwilling, and went north into the Humber with 60 ships, where he plundered in Lindsey, and there slew many good men.
Tostig's attacks do not appear to have gone entirely to plan, since the two armies of those who had deposed him the previous autumn had already deployed to protect the coast. The action of spies and informants are reported in Norman sources, and it is probable that all sides were well informed about what the others were doing, even if they could not be sure of Tostig's plan.
Earl Tostig came into Humber with 60 ships, but Earl Edwin came to the defence of the region, arriving in Lincolnshire with a large army, while Earl Morcar prevented Tostig from landing in Northumbria. On seeing this, the Flemish troops slipped away, leaving Tostig in the lurch, and sailed back to the country, laden with everything that they had pilfered from the unfortunate English.
But it was time for Tostig to retreat and await the arrival of King Harold's army. Happily, the King of Scotland owed Tostig a favour, as Northumbria had been his refuge as a child during the reign of the much maligned King Macbeth.
With 12 small ships, Tostig went to King Malcolm in Scotland, where Harold, King of Norway, met him with 300 ships, and Tostig submitted to him.
It is reasonable to view Tostig as the choreographer of the events leading to the Battle of Fulford. The ideal plan would have simultaneous invasions on England in the north and in the south. The dual threat meant that his brother, King Harald, was detained defending the south coast with his army deployed on the Isle of Wight. While Harold was ready to repel the anticipated invasion from Normandy, the northern brother earls were prepared for the Norse invasion.
Now King Harold sailed first to Orkney and left his wife Elisif and his daughter Maria there. He took with him from there Earl Pal, son of Earl Thornfinn and of Ingeborg, daughter of Earl Finnar Arneson.
The composition of King Harold's party, with his wife, one or possibly two daughters, and the younger son, suggest a certain confidence in this expedition, although by removing many of those who might have troubled the new young king, this also served to stabilise Norway in an uncharacteristic act of statesmanship for this self-centred old warrior. But ever cautious, the experienced campaigner left the females in the Orkney Isles, taking their earls and at least one noble woman as a guarantee of good conduct.
King Harold took his army south to England and made his landing at the place called Cleveland. Everyone took to flight. Then he went south to Scarborough and laid siege to it, but it was difficult to storm and was well defended. He went up a hill overlooking the town and made a great pile upon it, which he set on fire. And when the pile was in clear flame, his men took large forks and pitched the burning wood down into the town, so that one house caught fire after the other, and the town surrendered.
The opening action of the Norse invasion was intended to send out a clear message. The subjugation of Scarborough by bombarding it with fire, pitched from the old Roman watchtower, is typical of the tactical creativity of King Harold that would soon be demonstrated again at Fulford. The young earls would be facing an experienced and cunning warrior, still standing after a life of battling all the way from the Holy Land through to the northern homeland. Tostig is reported as attacking Holderness, where the Orkney sagas report a successful battle on the territory of one of those who had led the coup against Tostig the previous year. These attacks on Scarborough and the raids in Holderness might have been designed as a cunning ploy to tempt the young earls to leave York and come and chase these raiders. But there is a second important story about this journey. Travel was normally slow and transit times predictable. However, at the date given for this invasion, some exceptional tides can be calculated, which the orientation and the shape of the Humber estuary transformed into a tidal bore. Instead of having to march the army from the coast, or rowing the length of the Humber and the Ouse, where the flow of the river was normally against them, pushing them backwards. For several days each year it was possible to ride the flow, which carries the boats forward at a remarkable 10 knots.
Then Harold, King of Norway, and Tostig the Earl were landed with all the fleet along the Ouse near York.
While Simeon of Durham and Gaimar inform us that
King Harold and Earl Tostig with their fleets and with a quick voyage entered the mouth of the river Humber, where they entered the Ouse, at last disembarking at St. Wilfrid's.
And Gaimar adds some useful information about timing.
The next day they set sail straight for York, where they arrived as evening was falling.
And John of Worcester reports
Sailing up the Ouse against the stream, they landed at Rickle.
Reports of their quick voyage, as well as moving against the stream, plus an evening arrival time, confirms the tidal calculations for that date. There can be no doubt that the seamen and traders understood the timing of the tides. We can also be sure that Tostig, who had observed the impact of these tidal surges on the Fulford landscape, because he lived there. Although only a single source puts King Harald at Fulford on the eve of the battle, it is certainly implied by the others. And several also suggest that there were two flotillas. The logistics of moving a large fleet favours separate landing places. Archaeology suggests that there is only room for about 60 ships at Water Fulford, while the pool at Rickle offered almost limitless berths during these exceptional tides. The Domesday entry notes that Water Fulford Hall was possessed by Earl Tostig, so it was his hall when he was the Earl of Northumberland. We can therefore be confident that he understood how the tidal flooding could be exploited tactically during the coming battle. Arriving at Fulford on the eve of the battle was the second tactical ploy which would favour the invaders. Harold's arrival wrong-footed the young earls, Edwin and Morcar, who were now the brothers-in-law of England's king after the recent marriage of their sister, so uniting the houses of Mercia and Wessex. It is believed that this marriage was about to produce the first fruits of the union, as their sister Ealhgeith was staying with her fabled grandmother, Lady Godiva, in Preston or Chester. Faced with the arrival of King Harald, who was protected by both the tidal moat of the river water as well as autumn's darkness, a defensive redeployment was called for on the eve of the battle that would see the Mercian and Northumbrian armies split on the opposite banks of the mighty Ouse. The attackers held the initiative with three options available to them. The Norse fleet could sail into York on the morning tidal surge. The army could cross the Ouse during the very low ebb tide before dawn to attack York from the west bank. They could also stay where they were on the eastern bank and attack York from the south. The opening moves were made, and the scene was now set for battle action to begin the following day, once, of course, the tidal water had fallen. But the new day saw Tostig's arrival from Rickle. The young earls now knew that the man who they had deposed was not coming overland from the coast. He had also ridden the flood tide. York was not going to be attacked from the east and the west. The attack would now focus from the south.
King Harold elected to give battle. He landed and drew up his troops on the riverbank, with one wing towards the river and the other towards the still water of a deep pool. The king's standard was close to the river, where his battle array was densest, while it was thinnest by the pool, where the troops were least reliable. Meanwhile, the earls led their formation down along the river.
It is a 3-hour march from Rickle, but it would take just an hour for Morcar to rush reinforcements from York to the ford now that the pitch for the coming battle was set. There was time for these manoeuvres because battle could not commence until the tide ebbed, certainly not before 10 a.m. It was also about 3 hours after sunrise that autumn day. Apart from King Harald, all the other armies were in motion and getting into position to meet the developing threat on the tide-flooded landscape at Fulford. Tostig was arriving from Rickle, 12 kilometres away. Morcar was bringing his army from York, 3 kilometres to the north, and Edwin was redeploying his contingent of mounted housecarls, moving about 8 kilometres to defend the eastern bank of the Ouse, now that the invaders' plan was clearer. Things started well for Morcar.
Simeon of Durham reports, at the first onset of the fight, they overthrew many.
Even the Norse sources agree that it was going well for their opponents.
While the Norse sources say that, When the fighting had been going on for a short time, the flank of Harold's army lining the ditch gave way, and the Englishmen pressed them hard at that moment, expecting the Norwegians would flee. Heinz Kringler gives a few more details. When the earls advanced downwards along the ditch, the army of the Northmen's line, which was at the ditch, gave way, and the Englishmen followed, thinking the Northmen would fly. The banner of Earl Morcar advanced bravely.
But this was a trap. Morcar had now left the defendable high ground to take the fight to Tostig. In doing so, he was no longer able to see what was going on beside the river, where King Harald had deployed his army.
When King Harald saw that the English array had come to the ditch against him, he ordered the charge to be sounded and urged on his men. He ordered the banner, which was called Land Ravager, to be carried before him, and made so severe an assault that all had to give way before it, and there was a great loss amongst the men of the earls.
This was a classic outflanking move. King Harald had the benefit of higher, drier ground to rush Edwin's forces that had just picked its way along the bank between the Ouse and the floodplain of the Ings. Once across the beck, his men could attack the advancing army of Morcar from behind.
King Harald with his troop advanced so hard that the enemy gave way before him in two directions. Then flight broke out in the land army, and the flank that was nearest to the ditch jumped into it.
Battles have turning points, and the charge across the beck beside the Ouse employed the waterlogged landscape to split the defenders. Having already stranded most of the Mercians on the west bank, the falling tide now allowed Harold to drive a wedge between the Earl's two armies. By focusing the full force on this small band of Mercians, he was now able to surround the Northumbrian army that had left the high ground as they advanced.
King Harald led the attack with his troops, and joined battle so fiercely that the enemy was split and the local army began to flee.
Understanding the way the tide would work to the advantage of the attackers, doubtless using the inside knowledge provided by Tostig, who had watched the workings of the tide from his hall at Fulford for over a decade, the final act would now be long and bloody.
Eystein had gone through the array of the English and killed Akai the Tall. Then he sees that Morcar had got at the back of Tostig's army, and so he moves with his men to the back of Morcar's men. As soon as Earl Morcar saw that, he ordered his men to face about and defend themselves well and manfully.
It is Earl Ora who will later lead the dash to save King Harald when he is ambushed at Stamford Bridge just 5 days later, who leads the charge across the beck, which gets behind Morcar's advance at the ford. With the Earl's armies split, there are now effectively two battles.
Fighting manfully at the start, many enemy were overthrown. After a long contest, the English were unable to withstand the attacks of the Norwegians, and not without some small loss they turned to flee, and many more were drowned in the river than fell in battle. The Norwegians remained masters of the place of carnage.
The harsh logic of battle sealed the fate of the young earls. Edwin was trapped, with the river on one side, a marsh on the other, and no way out. Morcar's spears and shields that were advancing now have the enemy behind them. We should, however, note that much of the Mercian army was still intact on the west bank, and there is some evidence that suggests that it was this force that was employed by King Harald when he arrived a few days later for the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But we know that the earls survived, and the literature tells us just how they escaped, although the Norse sources all report that Morcar was killed, probably because they saw his banner fall. They also describe Earl Waltheof as the leader of the Mercian army, and it is indeed likely that he was prominent among the Mercian defenders. As we noted, Earl Edwin was trapped by the swollen river and surrendered.
By that time, King Harald had taken Earl Edwin prisoner. Then Tostig goes to the king and said, "Let those brothers both make the same journey. You would kill those that you capture, but I will have my way with him, said the king. The king addressed Edwin. I will give you peace if you will swear never to fight against me, and to send me word the same day if you know that treachery is plotted against me. Edwin replied, I will not swear that to save my life, but I will stand by my brother-in-law Harold so long as I may. But I will send you word if I know that treachery is plotted against you, if that will save my life. But I will swear no oath, for it looks to me as though Tostig does not mean me to have much inheritance. The king let Edwin go free. Tostig said, A senseless deed to let that man loose, who you think so good that he need not give you an oath. I believe, said the king, that his word is better than your sworn oath.
Some of Morcar's men make a last stand and hold the ford, allowing a significant force to escape along the ditch to a place where he could rally his troops.
The pool was full of corpses where the fleeing men had congregated. Some were driven into the water and were killed there, together with some who jumped into the pool and were speared, so that it was filled with corpses. They soon broke into flight, some running up the river, some down, and the most leaping into the ditch, which was so filled with dead that the Norsemen could go dry foot over the fen.
They retreated to a place where, as the literature says, no armed opposition was possible, and this can be uniquely identified on the ground. Two streams meet and have incised steep banks to create a temporary refuge surrounded by thick hedges to further impede any attackers. Archaeological evidence, however, suggests that after a short respite here, much weaponry was abandoned, since substantial evidence of metal working has been found along this retreat route. The inrush of tide would soon have flooded even this refuge, but that would also have made pursuit impossible.
They retreated to a place where there was no armed opposition, in the swampy ground around the pool. Earl Morcar had followed the standard closest to the pool, and Earl Waltheof fought the king more towards the river. He fled up along the river, and the troops with him were the only ones to escape. And there was much of the English people slain, and drowned, and driven away in flight, and the Northmen had possession of the place of carnage. And this fight was on the vigil of St. Matthew the Apostle, and it was Wednesday, the 20th of September.
The archaeological evidence suggests that after the battle all metal was quickly but thoroughly collected for reuse and recycling. Many hearths have been identified, along with many part-made items of weaponry such as axes, blades, plus some other tradable iron billets. The post-battle metal recycling hypothesis developed at Fulford would normally mean that ancient sites were completely cleared. Exceptionally at Fulford, the destruction of the Norse army just 5 days later at Stamford Bridge meant that much of the incomplete work was abandoned and then quickly buried by regular flooding in a place that has seen no use or development until now. By 5 o'clock, as daylight gave way to autumnal dusk, the tide resurged, submerging the ford and flooding the Ings. Organised action was impractical, allowing both sides to withdraw. The final words belong to the victors of the battle at this muddy ford. Several of the skaldic verses composed at the time are either reported or incorporated directly into the Norse sources. The Roman-era ford might well have prevented the bodies from being flushed into the Ouse by the ebbing tide and concentrated them, to give license to this description of the centre of the battlefield.
Earl Waltheof's men lay in the fen, by sword-down hewed so thickly strewed, that Northmen say they paved a way across the fen for the brave Norsemen.
Man may longer live as ween, ac im lichte overrench, Verder oft went into rain, Vel each market hit is blanch, ve vom and vuvi bitty venge, also valui vi gran, well awain is king na queen, that na sell drink of the strange, man evu valo vi bench, vi seen a quench. No, my strong na stock na keen, agi dies vita clench, na young, na old, na breed and sheen, all he revet and his strength, the vox and the liches his ranch, no man that again, well away na fret na bane, med ne list ne liches trench, man lets in and lust is stench, well do, well then.